So, good evening. And again, good evening to all those who are visiting us from other parts of the globe on this very sunny evening. Now we're complaining that there's too much sun on Bere Island, but I can see out of the window that there's quite a high cloud bank. So I would say in a few minutes, that's a little easier. In a few minutes we will see the sun disappear. But it's been a beautiful day here. Went out for a walk this afternoon and was watching all the newborn lambs running around with great vigour. I was thinking about what we were thinking on a couple of days ago about enthusiasm and energy, and how full of life and energy the newborn lamb is, and then somehow that gets lost quite quickly as they become sheep and just put their heads down and eat grass and look very ovine. But the energy of the lamb is probably what we need to try and retain on the spiritual journey. I'd like to continue looking at the narrative of the Passion and go to the next scene. This morning we looked at the scene in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus praying, struggling within himself and finding that place of acceptance. After hard struggle, his heart breaking and feeling alone and abandoned by those he trusted in most. And then the next scene, of course, is the arrest. And it's from now on that we begin to see how deep and strong the paradoxes of this story are. And we can only really understand the story if we do two things. One is to recognize the place of paradox within the story. And a paradox is an apparent contradiction, things that don't seem to go together, which in fact are necessary to each other. And we can only accept a paradox or enter into a paradox. We can't solve it. It's not a problem to be solved. A paradox is the way we enter into a deeper level of mystery, into a deeper level of understanding. And to the cognitive mind alone, as we were discussing it last night, paradoxes are really nuisances. I mean, they're irrelevances or they are mistakes. And we try to get around the paradox at the cognitive level. But at the deeper level of the heart, we recognize that actually these paradoxical moments or points in our life are moments of grace. They are portals, ways we enter into a new era, a new phase of our life, or a new level of consciousness. So we learn to live with paradox and, in fact, to be embraced by it. And there's this poem by Rumi, I think is a nice way for us to begin. How does a part of the world leave the world? How does wetness leave water? Don't try to put out a fire by throwing on more fire. Don't wash a wound with blood. No matter how fast you run, your shadow keeps up. Sometimes it's in front. Only full overhead sun diminishes your shadow. But that shadow has been serving you. What hurts you blesses you. Darkness is your candle. Your boundaries are your quest. I could explain this, but it will break the glass cover on your heart, and there's no fixing that. You must have shadow and light source both. Listen and lay your head under the tree of awe. When from that tree feathers and wings sprout on you, be quieter than a dove. Don't open your mouth for even a coo. And the key line in that, I think, that opens us to reading the story of these coming days: what hurts you blesses you. So, let's begin with the story as it is told in the first Gospel, the Gospel of Mark, in chapter 14. So, as we know, as you remember, the disciples have celebrated the Last Supper, the Passover meal. We'll talk about that tomorrow on Holy Thursday. And then, after singing the hymn, they went to the Mount of Olives, they went to the Garden of Gethsemane, and there he prayed and suffered alone. And after he had come back 3 times and found them asleep again, he says to them, "Still sleeping? Still taking your ease? Enough of that. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed to sinful men. Up, let us go forward." So this is where we left the story this morning, and with this very energized call of Jesus, having gone through his inner hell and suffered deeply, overwhelmed by grief and horror and dismay, his heart breaking. He's now in a very different place. Something has changed in him. Suddenly, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared, and with him a crowd. There was a crowd armed with swords and cudgels, sent by the chief priests, lawyers, and elders. So that's about all the establishment you could imagine. Now the traitor had agreed with them upon a signal. "The one I kiss is your man. Seize him and get him safely away." When he reached the spot, he stepped forward at once and said to Jesus, "Rabbi," and kissed him. Then they seized him and held him fast. Maybe we should just stop there, because there's a lot in that very concise, condensed account. We saw in the Gospel of Luke how an angel appeared to Jesus at his moment of direst need and gave him strength, a good angel. Well, angels, as we were saying, just appear. If you've ever met an angel in human form, that's usually an angel is somebody, what we would call an angel, is somebody who comes at the right moment and in a form that satisfies a deep and urgent need that you have. It may be just that need of the moment, but it's an urgent and maybe desperate need. And the angel is a messenger. The word, of course, means messenger. That brings the answer to that need in a form that satisfies it for you at that moment. So, angels, you can't ring up an angel delivery service and ask for an angel to be sent to you. You can't Google them. They just appear in the moment and in the form that is right for you. And maybe in a strange way, the same word appearing or manifesting is used of Judas coming. And Judas is clearly, if he's an angel, he's not a good angel. He's bringing a darkness and suffering, and as we'll see in a moment, opens the door to this most painful, one of the most painful of all human experiences, which is betrayal. And yet, in some strange way, he is an angel. Not a nice angel, but he has some of the characteristics of angels. And as we'll see from the way Jesus treats him and responds to him, there may be a sense in which he is bringing something necessary. In any case, Judas, one of the 12, so one of his small trusted group of disciples, one of the apostles, appeared suddenly, and with him was a crowd armed with swords and cudgels, sent by the chief priests, lawyers, and elders. Our chief priests, lawyers, and elders don't usually go around the town carrying swords and cudgels, or guns, or assault weapons, do they? But a High Court judge doesn't carry a gun under his robe, presumably. But maybe the policeman standing at the door of the court may be armed. So these are the authorities, these are the leaders of society. And what do we see about them? That although they are highly respectable and important people, to be respected and to be obeyed, and they don't dirty their hands with guns or cudgels or swords, but they are supported by these weapons of violence and people who use these weapons. So we see Jesus here encountering a naked display of violence. We haven't seen this before in the gospel story. We've had polemics, we've had them trying to catch him out, question him, but not this naked, crude use of violence. And we should be used to this because we live with this every 5 minutes on television. If you turn on the television any time of the day or night, within 5 minutes you will see somebody holding a gun to somebody else's head or in their mouth, or and the plot of the story that you're watching usually hangs on who's holding the gun. Then there's a big fight and one of them tries to take the gun, and 10 minutes of this fighting is supposed to be very exciting, and then one of them gets the gun and that's the one who wins. So we should be very familiar with this very crude understanding of power. And here we see that it isn't just naked power in the hands of robbers and criminals. This is society as a whole, depending upon the use of violence for its operation. There's a great book, I think, in the 70s by Elias Canetti called Crowds and Power. And as a young man, was a young boy in, I think, Romania, just before the war, Canetti, who was Jewish, suddenly found himself surrounded in the playground by a group of his playmates, and they had discovered he was Jewish, or they had heard their parents talking about Jews, so they surrounded him and started to taunt him. And of course it was a traumatic experience for this young child. And he managed, the family I think managed to escape from Europe or Eastern Europe before the Holocaust began. But this experience of the crowd and the violence of the crowd haunted him throughout his life. And he wrote this great book built on his own research into an exploration, examination of where this dynamic of the crowd and its use of power and the connection with violence, where it began and how it operated. And one of his conclusions was that this is in fact how society is built, upon a hierarchy of power structures in which we are all involved, in which we are held to account or held in place by the threat of violence, of some form of violence or another. And that the ultimate threat of violence in such a hierarchy is, of course, death. And the power of the state is such that it can take away your life. And so we are all held in this trap of the hierarchy of violence. And in that sense, the only free person, he says, kind of ironically, is the public hangman, the person who exercises the ultimate sanction of a society that is built on violence. And I think this is an important insight for us, or at least it's important for us as we enter into the full meaning of this story, to understand this association of society with violence. Because at the heart of this story is, of course, a very violent act, the arrest and condemnation and execution of an innocent man. And a crime against this individual that is sanctioned and authorized by the authorities. He's not being mugged by a robber, he's being executed and tortured by the authorities of his society, indeed the religious authorities of his society as well. So I think this theme is made quite clear when this crowd appears with Judas, armed with swords and cudgels, sent by, but of course not including, the chief priests, lawyers and elders. They wouldn't come along for an arrest, wouldn't dirty their hands with this kind of... I'm going to try to move forward. Is that okay? No, I can't? Oh dear. He is the one who must be obeyed. All right, I'll try and move back then. Is that all right? Okay, sorry if I'm looking a little bit awkward. Now, here we see a distinction, or contrast really, a strong contrast between Judas, who is one of the 12. And what is the 12? The 12 is a community built upon trust and love and a great teacher and following a teaching of non-violence. So a community of love. And Judas, one of the 12, comes accompanied by a crowd. The opposite of a community is a crowd. And it's in a crowd that power is manifested through violence. A community of love does not use the currency of violence. If it does, then it ceases to be a community. It's very tempting, of course, for any organization of people to use violence or the threat of violence or the fear of violence at times in order to maintain order or in order for the leadership to get its way. But if it does that, and the church has of course done that on many occasions, and many other institutions of society have done the same, then it ceases to be a community, becomes a crowd. Now the traitor, this is how Judas is described, had agreed with them upon a signal. The one I kiss is your man. Seize him and get him safely away. Now, this was before, they couldn't text a photo of Jesus on their iPhones, so they probably needed someone to identify him. And this is how he identifies. So here's a real perversion of what is a kiss. A kiss is a sign of trust and affection and intimacy. So here again is a very graphic image of what is going wrong, of how the order of things is being inverted, how community is being turned into a crowd, how loving and trusting relationships are degenerating into bitterness and betrayal. Well, that, you might say, is life. That happens. And who has not, in some way, experienced that or witnessed that? It's very ugly to see it, to witness it, or even uglier, to be part of it. When a community degenerates into factions and divisions and recriminations, or when a marriage breaks down and the love that brought two people together and held a family together becomes soured and polluted and turns into hatred and bitterness. So that's why that happens. So what we're seeing here, and indeed seeing throughout the story, is something that touches human experience very deeply and intimately. If we can't recognize ourselves or human experience in this story, then we're not reading it. We're not taking the leisure necessary for the story to read us and to illuminate the meaning of our own experience. And this is a level of experience or a dimension which, of course, we habitually run away from or brush under the carpet when we can. It's not a pleasant aspect of human nature, human relationships, when trust and love degenerate into betrayal and violence. But it happens. So we're seeing it happen, and we're being asked to see why it happens and where it comes from and what it means and how it can be dealt with. So the one I kiss is your man, seize him and get him safely away. That, of course, inspired Oscar Wilde's lines in The Ballad of Reading Gaol. Yet each man kills the thing he loves. By each, let them be heard. Some do it with a bitter look, some with a flattering word. The coward does it with a kiss, the brave man with a sword. The truth of betrayal is presented to us very graphically in this story. And betrayal is not just betrayal, or in formal or impersonal sense. It's something here that is touching our deepest identity when you are betrayed by someone you love, someone in whom you placed an absolute trust or hope. So, I don't know if you saw the film The Lives of Others, about life in East Germany during the Stasi period, when the secret police were constantly monitoring their suspects and invading private lives and turning people against each other. And at the heart of the story is this very painful and moving account of a couple. He's a playwright and she's an actress, and he's suspect for, under suspicion of being not a good member of the party, and he's being watched, and his wife, who is a very vulnerable person with an addiction, and also a great need to be successful in her career, is seduced into betraying him. And this happened, of course, many ways and many occasions throughout that period in Eastern Europe. So she betrays him and reveals his secrets, and hates herself, of course, for doing it, but is too weak not to do it. So William Blake says that it's easier to forgive an enemy than it is to forgive a friend. So the betrayal that really matters is, of course, the betrayal of the people who are closest to you, the ones in whom you trusted yourself. So the story opens with this dark truth about betrayal, our vulnerability to betrayal, and we see Jesus here as a victim of betrayal. Although he's a victim of betrayal, he doesn't act really like a victim. And we'll see in a moment how he responds to this. The tone of his response is what gives us the clue to its meaning. In the act of betrayal, when it's discovered, and you discover that you have been let down or betrayed, your first reaction is often shock and hurt and anger, and then maybe revenge, the desire for revenge, but quite often just the desire to isolate yourself and find a safe place to be, where this, where you will be safe, where you can't be hurt anymore. But sometimes it's more complicated than that, and after the initial shock of the betrayal has happened, you begin to ask yourself, or to see ways in which you had perhaps betrayed the relationship. Of course, every act of betrayal, like every relationship, is unique. But it's similar to what happens in Wuthering Heights when Heathcliff and Cathy, you remember this passionate relationship, and when Heathcliff, they swear lifelong fidelity to each other, but when Heathcliff comes back from his years away, he finds that Cathy has married the local sort of bank manager or something, and gone for a safe life. No offence to bank managers. But she's gone for a sort of safe life rather than the wild Heathcliff. And then there's this exchange between them where he sort of accuses her of betraying him. And, you know, she has been attacking him for coming back into her life and upsetting her life. And he says to her, "Why did you betray your own heart, Kathy? I have not broken your heart. You have broken it. And in breaking it, you have broken mine." So, in any act of betrayal, or not in any act of betrayal maybe, but in many acts of betrayal, we can't ultimately just take up the position of a victim. I mean, we may be a victim of an injustice, but relationships are often more complex than they seem at first. And I think the complexity of this relationship between Jesus and Judas is quite deep. In the other Gospels, for example, in Luke, if I'm not mistaken, he says, sorry, this is your moment. He's saying this to the crowd or to the people, the police who come to arrest him. This is your moment, the hour when darkness reigns. There's an acceptance in the way Jesus responds to this betrayal and to this exercise of naked violence against him, which he reads as in some way necessary, in some way fulfilling a prophecy, is the way he describes it. So there is a subtlety of moral meaning here, and it's not an obvious black and white moral case. Anyway, Jesus has been betrayed with a kiss, and by Judas, who is, when he reached the spot, he stepped forward at once and said to Jesus, "Rabbi," and kissed him. Well, to call him rabbi is to call him teacher. So you're saying, you are my teacher, and I am now betraying you. Then they seized him and held him fast, and Judas leaves the stage. But remember, what is being manifested here is violence, naked violence. The community of love has broken down, or is breaking down, and one of the party drew his sword. It's one of the disciples. Well, we know from the other Gospels that it was Peter, although discreetly some of the Gospel writers leave that out. But one of the party drew his sword and struck at the high priest's servant, cutting off his ear. Then Jesus spoke. And now this is where we see his response. "Do you take me for a bandit, that you have come out with swords and cudgels to arrest me? Day after day I was within your reach, as I taught in the temple, and you did not lay hands on me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled." Then the disciples all deserted him and ran away. So, here is naked violence disrupting the order of a community of love and civilized behavior. One of the disciples of the teacher of nonviolence takes out a sword and cuts off somebody's ear in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus heals the man's ear. It's his last miracle. But here we don't see that. But what is his tone of voice here? How is Jesus speaking? Do you take me for a bandit, that you have come out with swords and cudgels to arrest me? Day after day I was within your reach as I taught in the temple, and you did not lay hands on me. Does that sound, what does that sound?
It's a little bit indignant. I don't know if that's what you meant.
Indignant, yeah?
Surprised in a way, or challenging them.
Yeah.
They're controlled and calm.
What's that? Controlled and calm. Confident. Yes. He's very... What? Very straightforward, yes.
And he still has the kind of moral authority. You know, he says, I know who you are, and what is all this masquerade about? Why do you bother? Why didn't you just come and take me?
Okay. So would you say it was passionate, or was it rational? It's very rational, isn't it? And it's very difficult to be rational in the midst of violence. I mean, sometimes, you see people fighting in a pub or at a car accident in the street. There's a pretense of being rational in order to win the argument, but then they start hitting each other. The attempt to be rational breaks down very quickly. But here it seems very genuine. This is a very cool mind. Remember, this is a mind that a few sentences ago was going through a broken heart and overwhelmed by the fear of death. So what has happened?
Acceptation. He accepted his death,
Hmm.
and he said, "Let's go up." Like he's confronting the whole situation.
Okay, yes. So he's
He's done his preparation for it in that light.
he's done his preparation.
Yeah, he's been through his hell,
Yes, okay.
so he can face it.
Yes,
He says, "Come on, let's do it."
yes. He's certainly in a different place. What does that tell us about us, about ourselves? Is this just Jesus, or is it about humanity? It's possible.
Humanity at its best.
At its best, yes, okay.
When we are
Yeah.
best.
He would have made it much worse for himself if he had resisted and freaked out and lost his dignity, and it wouldn't have changed the outcome at all. But he would have had this terrible agony of, when you go into an emotion like that and allow it to drag you away. Then you are in this agony, plus the agony that others inflict on you.
Okay, so Jesus, thank you. So Jesus is, he's experienced betrayal. He's gone through the fear of death, which is a pretty big hurdle to get over, our deepest fear. He's sweat blood because of that fear. Then he's now experienced betrayal by one of his own trusted friends, and then by the rest. And he's been confronted with this naked horror of violence, which is a breakdown of all decent human relationships. It's stepped over the line, in if you're having a fight with somebody and verbally, but the minute you put your hand on them, you stepped over a line, and physical violence could erupt at any moment. So clearly, and this happens in between nations. It's what diplomats are supposed to be for, to prevent arguments from crossing over that line, or if that line has been crossed, to try to get back on the other side of it as quickly as possible to end physical hostilities, because once they've started, there's no telling where they will end. So this all seems to be happening in Jesus very quickly. That he's passed from the fear of death to this position of composure. In the midst of his passion, he is composed, he's present. And do we get through our dark nights as quickly as he did? How long does it take us?
More than one night.
More than a night. Okay. But this dark night of Jesus, and he says that this is the hour of darkness. So this is his dark night, and we have dark nights in many senses. St. John of the Cross speaks about it in a mystical sense as part of the journey of prayer, that you will go through a dark night in which you lose all sense of the light of God's presence, all sense of consolation or of peace or of being nourished, and you're just in this desert. So there's that kind of dark night, and there's the dark night of betrayal, or the dark night of sickness, or the dark night of death. So here he is, Jesus, in the midst of this dark night, teaching us by example here. And this is what the whole of the story is about. A profound teaching on the human journey, but not being taught as a lecture or as a through ideas, or through words even, but by example. This is teaching by example, living it out. Okay, that's the meaning of the story. So he responds, as we'll see him also respond in his trial, when he's struck by the soldier. He responds to physical violence with a dignity that is very rare, because normally when we are victims of physical violence, we are humiliated and we're pushed into something, into a naked, either a naked humiliation or a naked aggression, which is not true to ourselves. So we see Jesus here being true to himself. He's not just play acting. He's not just being cool because the cameras are on him, but he's speaking from a depth of his own composure. And at this moment, when his reasonable response to the violent attack clearly fails, they're not going to enter into a rational argument with him. Violence is not rational. When it's clear then that the dark night has begun and chaos is beginning, the disciples run away, abandon him. Then there's, in the Gospel of Mark, there's this very famous and rather enigmatic conclusion to this scene. Among those following was a young man with nothing on but a linen cloth. They tried to seize him, but he slipped out of the linen cloth and ran away naked. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
So what does that mean?
Lack of dignity.
Okay. Yeah.
Say to say
Yes, okay. Decided to save his life at any cost, yeah.
I think it's a bit of an angelic presence.
Okay, maybe he was the angel who was there. Yeah?
I mean, who is this? Who is this
Yeah,
young boy?
who is this young
To
man?
identify this.
No?
And he's there, but he's not there.
Hmm.
Maybe it's the final breakdown of the community.
Hmm.
He's naked, he has no protection now,
Hmm.
but everything's broken down.
Yeah.
Innocence.
Hmm. Kind of innocence, kind of breakdown. It's just one of those symbols that is quite difficult to give an ordinary explanation to. Frank Kermode, a great English literary critic, wrote a little book about, in which this was quite a central example of how enigmatic details play an important role in the way we relate to a text. Anyway, for whatever, we don't know what this means, but it means maybe all of these things, but it certainly holds our attention and it evokes something quite telling and dramatic, even though it's not easy to say what it is, but it's escape, it's the fear of being caught and running away with nothing. So I suppose that's certainly one simple explanation, is that the disciples as a whole really are now on the run, and we don't see them together again until the end of this part of the story, until after the resurrection. So maybe just briefly at the Gospel of Luke. One thing we might just, again in Luke, we see a crowd appeared, just as Judas appeared with the crowd in Luke's account. While he was still speaking, a crowd appeared with a man called Judas. So the crowd comes with Judas rather than Judas coming with the crowd. This transition from community to crowd is symbolic of how our minds and hearts and emotions can move in the flash of an eye almost. We can feel at times that we are, in a community of the self, that the different parts of our life, the different parts of our being are in harmony, in a harmony of love. And we can feel we've got it together. We are a community within ourselves. And then it can be shattered and it falls apart into warring factions and one part of ourself or of our mind fighting against each other. You could feel deeply in love with someone and your life seems to be harmonized by that beautiful feeling, and then the love can become jealousy. And as soon as it moves into jealousy, your whole view of life falls apart. And so there's that aspect, I think, to it. There's also the sense that that we find in any society that we may belong to, that communities are more vulnerable than crowds. Crowds tend easily to become violent. Communities have learned how to restrain and control violence, but that restraint and self-control is one of the fruits of meditation, one of the fruits of the spirit, anger management. But that self-control can be easily lost. And the crowd then becomes a frightening monster, just as our own minds can become monsters to ourselves. And yet, because the crowd is violent, we don't want the crowd to turn against us. And so, socially or institutionally, we often are frightened to oppose a crowd, and we go along with the violence of a crowd. A community is certainly more pleasant, but it also seems more vulnerable. So I think we're being, our reflection on solitude and community should take us into some of these aspects of the story quite helpfully. So in Luke, we see many of the same features of the story, of course. The cutting off of the high priest's servant's ear, his right ear, a little bit more graphic detail. But Jesus answered to the man who had done this, "Let them have their way. Let them have their way." He's not resisting evil. This is the embodiment now, as we'll see more and more clearly throughout the story, of non-violence, ahimsa. And then he touched the man's ear and healed him. So not only is he teaching non-violence, but he's repairing the damage done by violence. Although clearly he's not healing the instinct of violence itself. He's still the victim of this violence, and it's going to destroy him. So what does that tell us about how we deal with violence in our lives? When we find ourselves in a violent situation, verbally, psychologically, or even physically. What does it show about how powerful we are? We're not very powerful. We may not be able to save the situation.
Even with a miracle.
Even with a miracle. Well, but we may be able to make some small gesture, even though we are going to fail. The end result is going to be failure. But the gesture, the healing of one person's ear, is it's something that begins to hopefully redeem the horror that is beginning. A small act of kindness in the midst of the violence of a crowd. It's not meaningless, even though he's failing. Jesus is now going down a slippery slope. There's no rescuing him.
We don't know what happens to that guard
Mm-hmm.
after he's healed and he sees what happens to Jesus.
Okay, sure.
It's very interesting that he cuts off his ear, and he doesn't pierce him with the sword. He doesn't cut off his head.
Mm.
It's such a what a weird place to hurt somebody. He doesn't even cut off an arm. It doesn't seem very violent. It seems it's a totally kind of anodyne defense.
He missed the head, actually. I think he missed the head.
Well, maybe.
Okay.
It was dark and the guy moved.
Makes sense.
Okay, well. So anyway, again in the account of Luke, he has the same composure. Do you take me for a bandit that you've come out with swords and cudgels to arrest me? Day after day I was in the temple with you, and you kept your hands off me. But this is your moment, the hour when darkness reigns. So his acceptance of this is not a passive acceptance. If it were passive, he wouldn't have the composure, and he wouldn't be looking them in the eye and saying these things to them. Now, the question is, what is the importance for us in understanding the story and relating to the story in a way that's going to allow the story to change us, teach us, involve us? What is the importance of his composure, of his presence, of his looking at us in the eye, as it were?
It's a fidelity to truth.
Mm-hmm.
He's being true to himself and to the moment. He's not sneaking out of it or back. He's facing the reality, and he's also uncovering the hypocrisy of the other side
Mm.
in the actions that are going on. So it is faithfulness to truth
Mm.
that he's demonstrating.
Mm.
Do you think it's the acceptance that leads to the transformation?
Mm. Yeah, I think so. The acceptance is what opens the door to a transformation. But we have to think, we have to take the leisure, give the time, fulfill the capacity we have to listen and enter into the story as we're doing now. And that's why we listen to the story as a community, and why the listening to the story strengthens us as a community. Because, if you're watching a soap opera, a successful soap opera has probably been put together with a lot of, what do you call them, market research groups, what do you call those things? Focus groups, to find out what people want. What kind of characters do they want to see in the soap opera, in Downton Abbey, to identify with? Because we identify with these characters. Some part of ourself identifies with each of them, just as in a dream. The full meaning of the dream is that every character in it is a reflection of ourself in some way. So I think in the same way, the full wisdom, the meaning, and the redemptive power of this story only really happens when we see ourselves within the story and can identify or share, empathize, with what is happening as a whole, and then apply that to ourselves. We don't even have to. It's not so much a question of deep analysis or taking it apart. It's really allowing the force of the story to work on us, to read us, and maybe bring to the surface of our understanding an understanding of our own nature and of our own situation. And the only way we can do that is by entering into the story as we are now. Not in some kind of abstract way, but as we are embodied in life at the moment. So what you are going through at the moment, the questions, the hopes, the fears, the anxieties, the moods, the uncertainties that you are going through now, that's the chemistry with which you enter into a relationship with the story. Yeah. So I think again one of those lines from Rumi is a very helpful key. What hurts you blesses you. The wound is the place where the light enters you. That's Rumi, 12th century. I think Leonard Cohen must have pinched that. How else? There is a crack in everything. How else does? That's how the light gets in. Yeah. But Rumi, the wound is the place where the light enters you. And Oscar Wilde, how else but through a broken heart may Lord Christ enter in. How else but through a broken heart may Lord Christ enter in. So this scene, I think, is a very graphic portrayal of the experience of betrayal. And Father John once said that he thought that the purpose of education, Christian education, I think I mentioned this the other day, was to prepare the child for betrayal, because it's going to happen in some way. Maybe the weather betrays you, or Santa Claus betrays you, or your friend betrays you, or your partner betrays you. Or you betray yourself, as Kathy did in Heathcliff's understanding. So betrayal is going to be part of our life's journey and our experience of growth and healing. And we'll just end with this these 3 lines of the same poem, I think by Rumi, which captures the paradox that I was talking about at the beginning. Not until faithfulness turns into betrayal and betrayal into faith can any human being become part of the truth. Not until faithfulness turns into betrayal and betrayal into faith can any human being become part of the truth. Good. This is also from the Farewell Discourses from the Gospel of John, chapter 17. I am to stay no longer in this world, but they are still in the world, and I am on my way to you. Holy Father, protect by the power of your name those whom you have given me, that they may be one as we are one. When I was with them, I protected by the power of your name those whom you have given me, and kept them safe. Not one of them is lost, except the one who must be lost, for Scripture has to be fulfilled. Good. Well, we can take a few minutes. Are there any questions that you... Oh. Thank you. My question requires a little context, and so I will give the context first, and then the question. I haven't read this, so I hope it's suitable for live performance. As you continue on this path of meditation, what seems to have been the most significant experience for me is the sense of knowing the unconditional love which comes from the Source, Creator, God. Before, there was always a subtle sense that I will be loved when I am good. I tried to be good. When I failed, I felt that there would be a judgment in this of must try harder. However, increasingly, I experienced the knowledge of this absolute unconditional love. This is simultaneously accompanied by a sense of what sin really is. I would describe it as I love cats, as love being the kitten rolling over on its back, opening its legs, trusting to be loved, and sin being any reaction of violence to this vulnerability, openness and welcome. That is the context. So it's very good context by itself. But anyway, there's a question as well. What is it that makes us as human beings, when confronted with unconditional love, infinite, expansive and all-embracing, makes us respond in our daily lives as we responded to Christ in his passion with a desire to obliterate it, to humiliate it, or to kill it? Good. Good, very good question. Well, I suppose it's like the saying that you should be careful what you want or pray for in case you get it. Because what we want and aspire to is this experience of love in its purest and most expansive form. And yet, and that is clearly what we encounter in Jesus, in his teaching, and that teaching is then lived in this passion. There are moments in life where you teach and reflect on the teaching, but there are also moments where you just live it day by day, and you hardly know what you're doing, but you are living it. And there's maybe quite a dim awareness that you are really embodying the teaching, or the teaching is being made flesh in you through what you're going through. But it's certainly not an easy thing to live the teaching. And that's clearly what Jesus is doing. So I think what happens, though, when we do encounter that love is that we realize that we can only receive it by entering it. We can't keep it at arm's length. We can't control it. We can't play with it. We have to allow it full freedom in us. And that is going to cost. What it costs, we're not quite sure what it's going to cost, but it sends off all sorts of alarm signals that we are going to lose something.
Costs our own terms.
Costs are our own terms, yeah. So I think there's the ego, basically, I suppose in simple terms, what's happening is that the ego is perceiving a danger, something that is going to move it from its position of control, its customary way of, monitoring and acting as the security guard, and the ego is going to have to be suspended or transcended if this love that we encounter is going to be truly accepted. So I think there's a tension. In fact, there's a conflict. As you come closer to this love, there is more resistance at the same time. And that conflict is really what we were looking at in many of the Desert Fathers stories, and it's very dramatically lived out at a social level or communal level in the story of the Passion narrative. And it brings us over and over again to the fundamental meaning of this week, which is that it is about the manifestation of love, of God, in its purest and most simple form. And that manifestation of love, of universal, boundless love, throws a sharp and powerful light on all the shadows in the world and in ourselves, the shadows of our institutions, of our authorities, of our values, our social procedures, and of course it throws light upon the shadows within ourselves, our own fears and our own weaknesses. So there is conflict. I mean, in a very strange passage, in the light of Jesus' teaching on non-violence, he says, I have come not to bring peace but a sword. Conflict, not violence necessarily, but there will be conflict as the light and the shadow interact in ourselves. And I think that's what we see happening in the story. And the purpose of reflecting on the story is that we see how we can cope with that ourselves better. So thank you for the question. Oh, more. Okay, two more. Okay. Thank you. Shorter one. This is from Magda Jas in Canada. Eventually, hello Magda, if you're there. Eventually we have to let go of everything, willingly, as in meditation, or unwillingly, as in life events and death. Does escaping naked refer to that? Or rather, since he does escape, to the silence and stillness and darkness of John of the Cross, to escape from the ego. Very interesting. Very good. Yeah. So I think the answer is probably. Does escaping naked refer to that letting go and to the silence, the stillness, the naked? Yes, the idea of nakedness in the mystical tradition is very central to, to the idea of being ourselves. The Cloud of Unknowing speaks about the naked awareness of the self. Stefan has just written a book on mysticism and the body and medieval mysticism. You got anything to add to that symbol of nakedness?
Written too much. Yes, it's funny. In classical, in the medieval times, nakedness itself wasn't seen as something a bit unacceptable. It's not like Roman culture where it was celebrated. If you look at medieval statues and things, they're always clothed, and except the mystics, or the only people in the Middle Ages who used the term positively. They did see nakedness as being a way of coming to God.
Thank you. Yeah. So Magda, I think you've helped us understand that better. Thank you very much. Anybody got any other? Yes, Jason.
Did you talk about the thing with Judas? Because you call him a dark angel, and we often see him as an absolute others, and I mean, I think Jesus refers to only the one who had to be lost is lost. And I've read a series of poems that somebody has composed and given voices to the apostles, and of course we don't have any scriptural corroboration for those. But where Judas appears as somebody who feels betrayed by Jesus, he had these high hopes in Jesus, that Jesus would be king, and then Jesus tells him, no, you sacrificed all this to follow me around, and this is who I am. And of course we can see that as somebody who is attached to his illusions. But how come that, I mean, the other apostles fail as well, they all fail. Yeah. How come that this particular illusion is so totally other, so deadly?
And if I can follow on that, because I was going to ask also, this is the second time you take me down this path of looking at Judas in a different light. Last year I had a similar thought. And a few years ago, it hit the news. He said, that's this gospel according to Judas, and apparently it was uncovered. I don't know if it's any real or not, and I haven't read it. But I wonder whether, there is, what are your thoughts are on this idea of a gospel according to Judas? What would his truth be? And is there a redemption to Judas? To Judas? I mean, how what does that look like to us?
Well, the very fact that we ask these questions shows that Judas is a very powerful symbol in the story. And I suppose the very fact that this thing about the Gospel of Judas a couple of years ago shows that, well, it's kind of encouraging in a way that the story is at least still alive in the culture. We know what Judas means. If you call somebody a Judas, it's a pretty strong rejection of him. So it's a very powerful symbol. So what does it mean? Well, it means something so powerful. I think we have to find it in ourselves. I mean, all of the speculation is, why did Judas go to the authorities and sell him for 30 pieces of silver? And that is very unconvincing, really. It's kind of an explanation that, and that he needed the money. And that he had been, in one gospel we're told he looked after the money of the Jesus community. He was the bursar, or the accountant. So, but that somehow seems like a rationalization after the event. But the pure story leaves it kind of open what his motivation was. And that's the first thing. It may, what does that symbolize to us? A destructiveness, a capacity for destruction, for negativity, to push away the very thing we love. Each man kills the thing he loves. Each person kills the thing he loves, one way or another. So, is there something in ourselves that is quite almost irredeemably dark, and has to be taken very seriously? Well, there's enough manifestations of darkness in human history to justify that idea, perhaps, the inhumanity of which we're capable. So that's one thing I think maybe Judas symbolizes or expresses, is this irrational, there's no explanation for it, why we should want to destroy something good, that there is a dark rejection or pushing away, wherever that comes from, in ourselves. Perhaps it is from some place in ourselves where we feel so deeply worthless or unvalued or unloved that our only response to love or truth or goodness is to deny it. Anyway, so that's one aspect of it. And the other is, of course, that in the story, at least in one, in one of the accounts, Judas then regrets what he did and hangs himself. So he destroys himself. I this dark part of the story always reminds me of, some of the dark story of the Holocaust, and the destructiveness, the mad, crazy, irrational, but highly logical, irrational intensity of that period, 4 or 5 years of the Holocaust at its peak, and then the self-destructiveness of the Nazi regime, symbolized in Auschwitz, of course, where they then tried to destroy the instruments of destruction so that they would leave no evidence behind them. So it's the self-destructiveness of destructiveness, really. And, because the difference between Judas and Peter is that Peter wept but didn't despair and didn't destroy himself, whereas Judas does. But, so I think the moral universe of the story is expanded at this point, because is Judas really lost forever? Is he outside of the orbit of God's redeeming love? And if he is, then this seems to place a limitation on God's redeeming love. That's one point. The other point is, of course, that Judas, had the freedom to do what he did. This is where Origen, in the 2nd century, speculated, and many others have speculated, and Mother Julian also speculated in her theology of forgiveness and of love that ultimately all sin is forgiven, and all those who cast themselves out are eventually brought back in. Mother Julian, what does she say? A single great act, isn't it? What does she say? This great act event at the end of time. She said, all will be well, and all manner of thing will be well. And how that's going to happen, we don't know, she says, except there will be an event, an act which brings everything back. So that's, the moral meaning of the story has to be expanded way beyond our usual understanding of good and evil to accommodate that. And maybe that is part of the meaning of Judas in the story, is that this is as absolute a negation of God, of love, of goodness, of humanity, as one could imagine. And somehow it is hard to not to believe that the love of God manifested in Jesus in the story and in the cross and resurrection doesn't eventually incorporate even that part of ourselves which can be most dark and destructive.
Also, this bigger story of Jesus' offering for us in the cross. So the bigger story of the passion and the resurrection, there needs to be a Judas. I mean, for the story to take place, there needs to be a Judas. And in some of the readings that you just read about the ending of this passage, in the words that Jesus uses to refer to Judas, he seems to be understanding and kind to him. So one wonders to what extent, what does Jesus really feel about Judas? I mean, if everything has to happen, everything is happening as it has to in order to fulfill this greater, bigger, more important story. Isn't that redemption for Judas as well?
Yes.
He gave him the bread that always touched me when they have the Last Supper. He's still at the table, and Jesus let him be at the table and says also to him, "This is my body, I'm giving it up for you." That's always what touched me very much.
Right.
And helps me very much when I feel myself a Judas.
I think that's, if maybe Judas, there is a strange kind of intimacy or understanding in some of those passages between Jesus and Judas. Jesus knows what Judas is going to do, but he lets him do it. He says, what's got to happen has got to happen. So there's you could write a modern novel based on that narrative, which would explain some of those strange anomalies or strange enigmatic details, or maybe they are meant to be there. And in a way, Judas, as Henriette said, Jesus gives himself to Judas in the Eucharist. We have somehow gone on to think that the Eucharist can only be, or at one point in history, could only be received when you are in a state of grace. Well, Judas was clearly not in a state of grace at that moment, as we would say. So there's an inclusivity or unconditionality in the truth and the love that Jesus is manifesting that is bigger than we think, or than the way we think. And that is what the whole of the Passion story is about. Actually, we aren't seeing the whole picture. We're not thinking big enough. And we have to step outside of the box in order to see it. So Judas has an important role to play, I suppose, in challenging us to do that. Because if we reject Judas, aren't we undermining the universality and the efficacy, of the power of the redemption that is worked by Jesus in that manifestation of the truth of things, the way things really are. And I think, the way that figure of Judas was portrayed in later Christian history shows the danger of getting it wrong, because in paintings of the Last Supper, you can tell the figure of Judas because he looks Jewish. Yeah. Judas was always the Jewish-looking, whatever that means, but the Jewish-looking figure among the disciples. The others were all blonde and blue-eyed. So Judas becomes the scapegoat, really, which we'll talk about this later when we look at the scapegoat theory of the redemption. So Judas becomes the scapegoat, and of course this became merged with the anti-Semitism of later centuries. So, which is a complete and perverse misreading of the story. Because the whole point of the story is to expose that trigger reaction in human society. So he is an interesting figure. And I think it makes it difficult for us to read the story in simple black and white terms. It's much bigger than that. The good and evil is on a much bigger scale. What we think of as good or what we think of as evil is not adequate. We come back to that in saying of Jesus about the Father shining like the sun on good and bad alike, being kind to the ungrateful and the wicked.